Arunachala Shiva, Arunachala Shiva, Arunachala Shiva, Arunachala.
Arunachala Shiva, Arunachala Shiva, Arunachala Shiva, Arunachala.
This place has always been a major pilgrimage centre. Ramana, in a sense, was the latest and probably the most famous of a whole stream of extraordinary saints who've been drawn by the power of this place for at least, I would guess, 2,000 years. It's one of the 5 principal lingams of South India. This is the fire element, the place where Shiva resides.
In the last 15 years, there's been an explosion of Western spiritual teachers, many of them devotees of Papaji, who was himself a direct disciple of Ramana. And these people are traveling throughout the world offering satsang. Their message has touched a growing number of Western seekers. And it seems increasingly important to open up the ancient teachings so that this wider audience can understand their meaning. I would like this film to contribute to making the teachings of Sri Ramana more accessible, and in this way also the ancient teachings. I would like it to challenge entrenched ideas and encourage a healthy spiritual debate. So when Ramana Maharshi was 16, living at home with his mother and brother, he suddenly had an experience where he thought he was going to die. And he lay down on the floor and he accepted that death. And as he lay there accepting the death, he realized that it wasn't the body that was dying. He realized that something was happening which he didn't really understand, and he simply accepted it. This is somehow a rare case where somebody has spontaneously awoken at a very young age without really being in a situation to understand what was happening to him. But it just happened. You can say it happened by grace. But in that moment, he was able to look. He somehow had the wisdom to be able to simply look what was happening and to accept what was happening. And so he would have had a big opening, and we can call that self-realization. And he stayed going to school for a few more weeks until one day his brother pointed out to him, what's the point in going to school when you spend all day daydreaming? And so Ramana thought, well, that's true. So without telling his mother or brother, he took a little bit of money and he went off one morning, and after 3 days came to Arunachala mountain.
In 1974, I was at Oxford University, feeling very disenchanted with the reductionism of the standard academic methods and bankrupting myself on buying spiritual books, one of which happened to be Osborne's book, Ramana Maharshi's teachings. I think up till that point, I can't say I was seeking anything, I just had an insatiable spiritual curiosity. And somehow reading that book stopped my mind, not because it answered any questions, it just put me into a place where there weren't any questions, there weren't any answers. Somehow being exposed to Bhagavan's words in that book put me in a state that he was directing people towards. I didn't need to ask questions, I didn't need answers. There was just a very, very satisfying, contented silence. If you had asked me about it, I would have said, this man has answered my questions, but he didn't, he took them away. I dropped out of college a few weeks later. I thought there's more to life than reading these books and taking exams on them. I dropped out and became a hermit in Ireland for a while, practiced self-inquiry. I realized that I had nothing to do the next year, and my grandmother had just died and left me some money. And I tried to work out whether I had enough to go to India to visit Ramanashram for a brief visit, and decided I didn't. I think I decided I needed an extra £200 to make the trip. So I just offhand said, well, if £200 arrives, I'm off tomorrow. And the next day, of course, £200 dropped from the sky for no reason at all. So I thought, that's it, I'm off to India. Came for a visit in 1976 and never went back.
When I got to California, I decided, to hell with this goddamn spiritual thing. This is absolutely mad. I'm finished. I'm not going to do this spiritual thing anymore. I give up. I quit. And I decided that day that I'd go back to school, finish my degree, because I dropped out just about 6 months before I was to leave. Before I was to get my degree. There was no doership. I didn't feel like I was doing anything or anything of the sort. I just was this awareness and observing these things happen. And about 6:30, 7:45 in the evening, I was walking up Market Street, and a city bus, an empty, believe this or not, empty city bus pulled up. And there was a hippie driver in it who looked a lot like me. And he opens the door and he said, "Hey, you want to ride?" And I said, "Sure." And he dropped me off. He said, "I'll let you off here." And I thought, where am I? What am I doing here? Nothing. I just started walking. The body just starts walking up this street. It turns left and it enters this little house. I walked in, there's nobody there, and then I walked in through another door, and there are about 50 people in a room, all sitting quietly in these seats in meditation. They're all just silent as anything. There happened to be 2 chairs, one in the first row and one in the second row, that were empty. All the rest were filled. And so my body just went in and sat in the one in the second. Just sat there, and I'm thinking, what the hell is going on here? This is very strange. But it didn't matter because I was just completely beyond it all. And then about a minute later, again, just as if the whole thing was perfectly choreographed, I felt this presence coming. And suddenly, within my awareness, this holy man just comes and he sits right in front of me, and he just starts transmitting right back to me instantly. I knew that who he was, and he knew who I was. And the man gets up and introduces him. He said, "This is Swami Chinmayananda, and blah, blah, blah. He's going to give us a talk on Vedanta." And he got up and he started talking. And I realized that I met my teacher. I met my guru. And he immediately started talking. And every word was like, I tell you, it was like honey. It was like drinking nectar. It was the most, it was so beautiful. The next day I called up my girlfriend. I said, bye-bye. Called my parents. I said, bye-bye. I sold my car, collected my money, right? And I took off with this Swami.
Yes, my connection with him is something that grew out of finding an old photograph of Ramana Maharshi. So when I was with Osho, I rented some rooms in an old Indian palace, and the Maharaja of this palace, some 30 years before, was a direct disciple from Ramana Maharshi. So I found an original photo in my room, and this gave me a connection to Ramana Maharshi. In the beginning, I didn't know who it was. Gradually, I found out who this man was. I was very attracted to the beauty of his eyes, the peace in his eyes. And gradually, this photo sort of pulled me in, so to speak. And I gradually put a new frame and gave it an important place in my room. And I found out about his teachings, self-inquiry, who am I? And gradually, Ramana Maharshi had more and more influence. When I went to Papaji, I found that he also had a photograph of Ramana Maharshi, and he sat under this photograph to give his meetings. And I found out he'd been a direct disciple also of Ramana Maharshi. So with this influence, I also came to visit Ramana Maharshi's ashram, and I became more and more familiar with his teachings. And now every year I'm drawn for 2 or 3 months to go to this small town where he was living in South India, at the mountain, the holy mountain Arunachala. And I would say now, after some 20 years of having a connection with Ramana Maharshi, with Papaji, with Osho, in a kind of very gradual, a kind of very quiet, delicate, gradual way, Ramana Maharshi has become the most important influence in my life.
What was unique about Ramana was that at age 17 he actually was able to extract the knowledge of who he was from the experience. Now the word Ramana actually means what? The actual meaning of the word Ramana means the one who revels in the hearts of everything. Now what would that be? Awareness. That would be the self.
The day he arrived He threw away all his money into a local tank. He shaved his head, which is a sign of physical renunciation, threw away all his clothes, and just sat under a tree and closed his eyes. And so far as he was concerned, his business with the world was over. Around 1901, he moved up to Virupaksha cave and stayed there for about 15 years. Ramana himself said nothing changed in him from 1896. He said it might have looked like I was meditating or doing some kind of practice, but I just had my eyes closed. Now I have them open. He said that's the only difference.
But who was speaking? See? Nothing ever changed for anybody forever. Why? Speaking as the self. So if he's speaking as the self, that's absolutely true. But what about that person named Ramana? What about that person? See? The practice is for that person. If that person is not there, then there's no practice being done. But there was a person there named Ramana. He sat in a cave. He was still a person. Now, if he actually realized he was the self, then why would he leave anybody? In fact, if he realized who he was at that time, he wouldn't leave his mother, he wouldn't leave his lifestyle or anything. He would suddenly gain what? All of those things. All of those things he'd see as himself, and there would be no reason to walk away from them. But what's he doing sitting in that cave for 20 years? Huh? He likes caves? If he's so enlightened, he could go home and eat Idlis and play cricket like any normal 17-year-old, enlightened 17-year-old. No, he's sitting in that cave. He must be applying that knowledge to his own mind. What else is he going to do? He comes out with this tremendous confidence and peace, because he's knocked down all those desires and all those fears, all of that subjective stuff. He's just said, hey, I'm not doing it. I can sit here in this cave and do nothing. No matter what you tell me, mind, I refuse.
When the building started, Ramana himself was involved in that?
I don't think he built this first coconut leaf hut, but once he moved down, he was hands-on. Muruggana was a very well-respected Tamil scholar. He came in 1923 when the ashram at the foot of the hill was very small, very primitive. On the day he arrived, he said there was one coconut leaf hut and Bhagavan was the only person present in it. I mean, that was a common experience of people who came 22, 23. He had composed 11 verses in the main temple in town. The predominant theme of all of these verses is, I'm coming to you because I think that you're Shiva incarnate. I want your grace, please help me. And Bhagavan came out of his hut and Muruggana tried to sing these verses and he said he couldn't even speak in Bhagavan's presence. He was completely paralyzed. Bhagavan got tired of waiting. He said, give me the paper, I'll sing them for you. He kind of went through the whole 11 verses and chanted them out loud and gave the paper back. Muruggana stayed on that occasion. Now at some point, probably in the first year or so, he says he was picking leaves for leaf plates with Bhagavan in Pelakottu at night. And he said Ramana just looked at him, and in that moment he got enlightened. Now the thing about Muruggana is that you could never ever get him to talk about his personal history. He seemed to think that Muruggana the person had ceased to exist. From that moment on, he started spontaneously composing verses in praise of Bhagavan. He was already a good poet before he came to Bhagavan, but somehow this experience turned him into a magnificent, spontaneous poet who could just churn out verses non-stop all day, every day. There are 20,000 poems in there.
20,000?
20,000. And they're absolutely magnificent.
I think one reason people really like Ramana, because he was like a regular guy, more or less. I mean, he did sit in his underwear, you know, on a white sheet and do nothing, basically, which is not exactly normal. But for Indian saints of his caliber and his character, that was extremely normal lifestyle for him.
If he was off doing some work and enjoying it, whether it was cooking or building a brick wall, somebody would come and say, some visitors have come from Hyderabad, and his face would drop and he said, oh, you know, goodbye, I have to go back to jail. And he'd sort of he'd go and sit on the couch and tell people how to get enlightened. He really enjoyed cooking. He was the head cook for, I'd say, at least 15 years. Got up at 2 o'clock every morning to cut veg and supervise the cooking. When the buildings were going up, he was engineer, architect, hands-on every day.
Because I think what you've just been speaking about is, in a way, very important in general, because, you know, nobody really seems to know what enlightenment is, but if anybody has some image of it, it is of a man sitting, doing nothing, being very blissful. And what you're describing is completely different from that.
It's nothing to do with what you do or don't do.
He lived a pure sattvic lifestyle. Sattva, the reason they call it sattva is because it is of the nature of sat. Sat means awareness. So the mind is awareness. He ate very sattvic food. He was very fussy about food. He insisted on cutting the vegetables and cutting them a certain way. Why? Because he understood the science of sattva. He probably selected, he could tell the vibrations of things he could put into his body. He lived very, very simply. He didn't wear a lot of clothes. All these things, all of those are signs of a person who's following an extremely sattvic lifestyle. And because of that, the radiance is there.
But the people who worked in the kitchen, each and every one of them will say his word was absolute law. There was absolutely no possibility for ever varying any routine that he told them to do. And what he was trying to teach them wasn't cooking or preparing a meal on time, it was absolute obedience to the Guru. So for example, he would bring in some completely inedible, hard, spiky plant and say, boil this, we're having it for breakfast. And you couldn't say, but it's inedible, not even the goats will eat it. You said, yes, Bhagavan. And you had to stand there and stir this pot for 4 hours in total faith that this would turn into something tasty because Bhagavan had told you to do it. The whole point wasn't to be rational or efficient. It was to have absolute obedience and surrender to Bhagavan and do what you were told. So there was an intense frugality that bordered on parsimoniousness. He hated wasting anything. He'd pick up single grains of rice off the floor and order them to be taken to the kitchen and stored. I mean, that was the level he was on.
One of the greatest stories of Ramana, one of my favorite Ramana stories was he'd been out during the day and he came back to the ashram at 12:30 and there was a sign on the ashram gate, ashram closed from noon to 2, and Ramana sat in the dirt until they opened the gate to go in.
He was very, very particular about not being given better treatment than anybody else, which was a big issue for many people in the ashram because they wanted to show their devotion by giving him better quality objects, more food in the dining room, better quality food. I think for several decades there was just a running battle between Bhagavan, who was saying, serve my devotees better than you say and I'll be happy, and devotees who could never accept this and were always trying to give him bigger and better. He had squirrels on his sofa. That was they moved in, made nests over his head, and ran around all over. Kind of had babies in his cushions. When the new hall was built, that was the last place he moved into in 1949, because the old hall was too small. And when they tried to move him in there, he took one look at it and said, "Where are the squirrels going to live?" and walked out again. Right.
Couch.
Yeah. Well,
it seems to be for the wrong person. I mean,
well, exactly. He took one look at it and said, "Make the stone Swami sit on the stone sofa. I'll go somewhere else." He had a habit of ignoring a lot of people's questions. I'm not saying everyone got a civil, prompt answer. You could come in and ask an apparently earnest question, and he could stare out the window and ignore you for an hour and pretend you didn't exist. I think a lot of people were intimidated by him, too scared to speak.
I think it was when he was still up in the cave. Somebody came and asked him what his teaching was.
This was 1901. I suppose his basic question is what is reality and how is it discovered? And the conversation developed from there. But they were extraordinarily terse answers because Bhagavan wrote with his finger in the sand, so that there's a limit to the amount of sparkling dialogue you can have when... Then Bhagavan himself took the longest question and answer version and rewrote the whole thing as a prose explanation of his teachings. And that nowadays is what you buy in the bookstores. Who Am I? It's Bhagavan's own summary of these answers that he wrote with his finger 20 years before. It's called Who Am I, but it covers all kinds of things. The nature of happiness, what the world is, how it apparently comes into existence, how it disappears, plus a fairly detailed explanation of how to do self-inquiry.
So Sri Ramana became known for his teaching of Who Am I, which in another way we can call self-inquiry. He had the idea that you can constantly keep your mind on the source inside yourself, rather than always externalize it to objects or to people. So Ramana then was asked, what is the means for constantly holding on to the thought, who am I? When other thoughts arise, one should not pursue them, but should inquire, to whom do they arise? It does not matter how many thoughts arise. As each thought arises, one should inquire with diligence, to whom has this thought arisen? The answer that would emerge would be, to me. Whereupon, if one inquires, who am I, the mind will go back to its source, and the thought that arose will become still. With repeated practice in this manner, the mind will develop the skill to stay in its source. You see. So basically, if you got very, very quiet, you can even see thoughts arising. It's almost like they come out of the ocean. You know, you're looking at the horizon of the ocean, and you can see these thoughts like little paths that just come out of nowhere, a thought. It's just a thought. And what happens? We take this thought and we say, my thought. And so what self-inquiring is suggesting is that you don't take the thought. You don't take it. And if you don't take it, then it's actually no problem. The thoughts come, the thoughts go, thoughts come, the thoughts go, no problem. It's just something very subtle. When you really see this, you can see that it's an illusion. You can see for yourself. It's not like anybody needs to tell you. This is something you have to see for yourself. Nobody actually can show it to you.
But retain it in the heart is what is called inwardness. Now here's an actor and here's an action going on here. This is what's called yoga. Yoga is about doing and acting and experience.
I mean, what I understand, and this is somehow the crux of self-inquiry, yeah? What is self-inquiry?
Yeah, that's right.
Is that whatever you do, yeah, whether you're sitting in meditation and not much is happening physically with the outer, you're very focused inside, or if you're moving through the world doing various actions, either way, your attention has to be on the self. I am the self. Not I am the doing of this or I am meditating. It has to be, you have to be focused, on the self.
He defines another place self-inquiry as holding the mind on the self.
Yeah.
And this is what he's talking about here. It's keeping the mind inward and keeping it in the heart, what he calls the heart. The heart, there's another name for the self. You got a problem here is because you got to get rid of the one who's doing the focusing. So,
That's right.
so he's, that I is not the self. That's the ego I that's doing this.
But initially it has to be
Initially it has to be the ego. The
yeah?
ego's got to do it. That's right. And later on, then that I will be let go of.
When you say let go of, there isn't anybody to let go of, yeah? So is it just like a dissolving?
Well, the knowledge I am the self destroys it, dissolves it.
People think Bhagavan taught self-inquiry as his particular teaching. It would be more accurate to say that he really didn't have any missionary zeal for self-inquiry, although he did say that sooner or later people have to come to inquiry to get the right final answer to who they really are. But he didn't push anybody. But if you came to him and said, Bhagavan, I'm not doing anything at all, I want to get enlightened, what's the quickest way? Then he might say, do self-inquiry. But you really had to come with a clean sheet. You had to have no history of doing a particular practice for him to say straight away, do self-inquiry.
Is he on record as saying that that is in fact the quickest, most direct way?
Yes, yes.
In the book Day by Day with Bhagwan, he's quoted as saying, persist in the inquiry throughout your waking hours. That would be quite enough. If you keep on making the inquiry till you fall asleep, the inquiry will go on during sleep also. Take up the inquiry again as soon as you wake up. So this is like a constant remembering, constant remembering. So we could say that for self-inquiry to really function well, you need to have got a quiet mind, a still mind from spiritual practice, you see.
And he said that you had to keep on doing it up till the moment of realization. It wasn't do it once or do it for an hour a day sitting in the corner. He didn't even approve of it as a sitting down practice. He said if you're a beginner, then it's good to get started, to sit in the corner and close your eyes and do it just to get the hang of it. But once this quest is underway, then he said you do it all day. Whatever you're doing, that question should be there all the time.
Ramana said, you have to ask yourself the question, who am I? This investigation will lead in the end to the discovery of something within you, which is behind the mind. Solve that great problem, and you will solve all other problems. So this I is somehow the key. You see, it's like if you consider a bridge, one of these arch bridges, they put the stones, and then in the middle of the bridge they put what they call the keystone. And this keystone locks all the other stones. So if you want to break the bridge, you can just break this keystone, everything falls down. So in this way you can say that if we can really come to see the meaning of this I, then all the things that are attached to this I, it all falls down. So what falls down is our identification with being a somebody. It's very hard to see it because this has been building up for many years, slowly, slowly, slowly. It started when we were too young to even perceive what was happening. It was happening to everybody around us. It's perfectly natural. Everybody goes through this. And by the building up of this identity, we came to believe in this identity. And yet this identity is only existing in the mind. We call this identity me. And every moment of our life, we are talking from this me. So I'm doing this, I'm doing that, I'm going to do this, I did it last year. I. So who is this I? And Ramana is saying that if we come to understand the meaning of this I, then everything falls down. And of course, every thought is coming to me. I'm always the one. It's always me. So when you ask yourself, who has this thought arisen? Who is sitting in this chair? Who is talking? It's always to me. It's always me. Because that's our identification, me. And so once you come to this first question, or the first answer of me, you then ask, who is this me? Who is this me? And there is no answer to that question. So this is not an intellectual kind of inquiry. This is an inquiry using these two questions, and the second question takes you to the source, takes you to your true nature, takes you to the self. And that there's no answer in that. It's like the self is not an answer, you see. So it brings you to this nothing. So the answer to the second question, if you like, is nothing. It's a deep sense of emptiness, of nothingness.
The nicest analogy that Ramana gave out was having a cow in a stable with the door open. He said the yogis beat their cow and make it go into the stable and lock the door, and the cow's very angry and is always trying to break out. He said, my technique is to leave the door open and then follow the cow around with the grass and slowly tempt the cow back into the stable, fill the stable with grass. Sooner or later the cow realizes it doesn't need to go out to eat grass because there's plenty of grass at home. So it sits contentedly in the stable, munching its endless pile of grass and doesn't go out anymore. So this whole process is taking the mind back to its source and giving it the experience of peace and happiness in its source with such regularity that finally something connects and you think, well, I'm better off staying there. Why do I need to go out for my happiness, for my joy, for my peace? There's far more of it back here, and every time I do go out I just get into trouble. I may as well stay at home. It's getting enough momentum, enough repeated experience of that place inside where you experience that peace, that joy, to realize there's no point going out looking for it anymore.
And in that very moment when you realize that there's plenty of grass at home, and therefore why would I go out, you could call that awakening?
Understanding that the notion of being better off at home belongs to the I, and that I has to go.
Self-inquiry should be conducted according to scriptural lines. We need a means of knowledge. The means of knowledge is there to direct our inquiry. I may have a pure mind, but I don't know how to ask questions or how to analyze myself or how to operate this means of knowledge myself. Because self-inquiry isn't asking a question. It's a questioning attitude. It's a thoughtful questioning attitude, but it's not asking the question, who am I? The reason it's not asking the question, who am I, because who am I is already known. Everybody in the spiritual world knows their consciousness. I'm not short of knowledge about who I am. Now I may be short of confidence in that knowledge, which is an entirely different thing. And I can gain that confidence if I can do an inquiry properly. I can gain the knowledge of who I am.
It's very specific. It's finding out where this sense of I arises from. So he would say each time you find that your attention has gone to an object of thought or perception, for example, you're thinking of what you had for breakfast, or you're looking at that tree, then he said, adjust your attention from the object that's being perceived, the tree or the memory of breakfast, to that person who's perceiving the tree or having the memory of breakfast, and then find out where that feeling of I arises within you. Try and track it back to its source. It's a very active pursuit.
It's very easy to get caught up, you see, because it all feels so much part of my movie. I'm hypnotized by my movie. When you're really hungry, what do? You go to the kitchen and get some food, you know, or you know, kill a kangaroo or something. You know? So, I mean, that's not what we're talking about. You know, that's like something real that happens in the moment. Yeah, you get thirsty and you drink some water. You know? But very often, what happens is that we're thinking about food. You know, we think about, wow, wouldn't it be nice to have some cold ice cream right now? You know. And then we think, where can we get the ice cream? And then we think, oh, I'll go on my bike, you know, and then my bike's broken, and, you know, and it's just going on in the mind. There is no ice cream. There's no reality about it. When you really need to drink, you just drink. So this has a different quality.
When you look in the dining hall now at the photographs, it's clear that there was a small group which gradually expanded as the 30s and then the 40s, but mostly men, and all looking powerful and serious, one might say.
Right. Namale Swami was the attendant in the bathroom, and he asked the question, the ananda that sadhus get from smoking dope, is this the same ananda that enlightened people have? But Bhagavan laughed, and then he kind of imitated a stoned sadhu and kind of staggered around the bathroom saying, "Ah, Ananda, Ananda, Ananda," kind of pretending to be a inebriated sadhu. And just at the right moment, he kind of lurched onto Anamale Swami and gave him a big hug. And in that moment, Anamale Swami said he lost all consciousness of the world. He just said he was aware of the self in that moment, and the world disappeared. And that Bhagavan himself abandoned him in the bathroom and went back to the hall. And when he came to, he was just standing by himself in the bathroom. And he said he knew in that moment his career at Ramanashram was over. It wasn't a question of Bhagavan telling him anything. He went back to his room, cleared out his stuff, took his keys, gave them to Chinnaswami. Everyone was absolutely amazed that this was a man who worked, 12, 15 hours a day, non-stop for 12 years. Had no quarrels, no fights, there was no reason for him to leave. He just handed in his keys and said, "I'm off to meditate in Pelakottu." And of course he went to Bhagavan and announced his decision. This is something interesting. It was very hard to get Bhagavan to give you a decision about what you wanted to do. What he wanted you to do was make the right decision and tell him, and then you would show some sign that he'd approved.
In the presence of the Guru, it happens. Now, in the presence of the Guru, that's a tricky kind of thing. How does that work? Sometimes it works through words. Sometimes it works by just sitting there and observing the Guru and seeing from where the Guru sees and seeing how the Guru operates his life from that position, and seeing that you are that position, and then you start operating your life from that position, and suddenly you see that there's nothing to do and you're free.
Is there a difference between awakening and enlightenment? I mean, obviously we're just using words, but are there two different states?
I would say the self is always the same, and the self, being aware of itself, is always the same. Now what can happen is a temporary suspension of mind, so that there is a direct experience of the self, but I think that is at a very subtle level. The I is experiencing the self. So it's not a full experience of the self, it's a dualistic experience, preview of forthcoming attractions, if you like. It's a deep experience of knowing what the self is like, but it's still mediated through an I. And while that I is there, then full enlightenment isn't there.
Does that mean that the second state is very, very, very rare? Is that what we're saying?
Bhagavad Gita says, how do they do the numbers? Out of every 1,000 people, I'm paraphrasing this, kind of one is really serious, and out of every 1,000 serious people, only one knows me as I really am. So that's 1 in a million. And I think that's a very generous estimate. I think it's far worse than that.
I've met many enlightened people in India who are as luminous as Ramana. They just aren't famous. Why? Because they did yoga. They applied that knowledge to their mind, so the mind was radiant. And that radiance has a huge effect on people. You see these enlightened people, you look at the confidence they have, amazing confidence to withstand anything, to face any kind of situation in life. And where does that confidence come to? Simply standing up to their mind, taking a stand in awareness as awareness.
Well, Ramana said there's 2 indications that somebody might be in this state. And he said the peace you feel in their presence and the equality they display to all the beings in their vicinity. But he said these aren't proofs. He said these are only indications. He said if you're in that state yourself, then you just need to look at someone and you know. And if you're not in that state, nothing they say or do can be held against them as a disqualification for being in that state.
Would you like to say something about Papaji? Would you perhaps in some way put him into the context of the structure of the disciples around Ramana?
And he was saying that the experience of the self needs to be confirmed and corroborated by a master. And that's what happened when I met Bhagavan. All the dialogues that took place when he encountered Bhagavan related to this problem Papaji had of seeking some kind of external vision of Krishna which would give him an ecstasy, whereas Bhagavan told him what comes and goes is not real, only the self is real, it never comes and goes. What use is a God who comes and goes? Stay as the self. So, in a sense, what he received was the destruction of his desire for an external form of God to give him ecstasy. He didn't receive anything new, he didn't become more enlightened. Somehow he was shown the diamond he already had and was told, stop looking for anything else, you're wasting your time, you got it already.
But isn't this what in fact everybody's got already?
We all tend to think that self-realization will be self-evident, obvious, so overwhelmingly real, peaceful, ecstatic, blissful, that we'll know we've got it.
If we look at this influence in the world at large, which I do believe is there, that there's actually a lot of interest in Ramana Maharshi and his teaching.
If we're talking about influences, people who made the West aware of Ramana's existence and his teaching, number one or earliest would be Paul Brunton. Probably for about 20 years his writings were the principal reason why people came to Bhagavan.
You could say in the last 10 or 15 years that out in the greater world there's more and more interest in Ramana and his teaching.
I think he's very much an iconic figure. Somehow he's the yardstick by which other people measure their status in the spiritual world. He's just he's an emblem, in a way, of everything that's best in Indian spirituality.
I think there's some truth in that, yeah. He's a sort of spiritual emblem, and the emblem is this man lying on a couch, silent, beautiful eyes. And so the way you describe him, I think, is very important. When a more rounded picture emerges, then that image of him as this sort of icon in silence, you know, onto which you can almost project what you like, that's going to get changed, because he obviously said a lot of things which actually might be things that people don't want to hear.
Did he not have any thoughts or desires or feelings in his mind whatsoever?
I think that's what some people would absolutely.
Well, they do, and that's part of the Ramana myth, the big Ramana myth. And that's a very convenient myth, because that's created by people who have no self-confidence and who are lazy. And so they want to make Ramana into some great big incredible thing and think that, what, I couldn't possibly be like that. So they don't really try to realize who they are. They just worship this form or this deity or this incredible person who supposedly got lucky or whatever it was. Ramana was a normal guy. He just happened to find out who he was at 17. Where is his authority to teach self-inquiry if he didn't do self-inquiry?
there's a very biased record available of what Ramana is like. The books that you get in the West tended to be written by, you know, the lawyers, the doctors, the people who had writing talents who could find a publisher. So they tended to describe their visits to the old hall where Bhagavan sat and answered philosophical questions, told people to do self-inquiry or told stories. The people who worked in the kitchen were for the most part illiterate, so they didn't really ever get round to writing books or telling their side of the story. So in a sense, yes, it's a one-sided image of Bhagavan. Everyone I've spoken to who knew Bhagavan personally has told me the books give a misleading picture. They just don't tell you how strict, how severe, how randomly angry he got. People sit down and they write down, I walked into the hall and he looked at me and I was in peace and bliss.
That's right.
And somehow they cross out the 25 occasions he screamed at them don't get reported. So, I mean, Lakshmana Swami told me this, for example. He said you just never knew who he was going to turn on, for what reason. See, at each particular moment, he's reacting to what's going on in somebody's mind. And if I start screaming at you, people will think, what did he say, what did he do? But with Ramana, it's what's in his head in that moment. So what was going on externally is often nothing to do with how Ramana is reacting to you. He's seen, felt something that's going on inside you, some attitude, something. And quite randomly he would just look at someone and really abuse them. For nothing they'd done, just something he could see in that man he needed to be abused at that moment. Lakshmana Swami said he was watching Bhagavan walk across the courtyard by the dining room, seeing a man from Madras feed puffed rice to a peacock. Now that should have scored some points with Bhagavan. He liked people taking care of the animals. He just looked at this man and screamed at him and said, go back to your court in Madras, you don't even know how to feed peacocks properly. What was going on? Who knows? Something was going on in that man's mind as he was feeding the peacocks, and Bhagavan screamed at him. People tell me this is what happened all the time.
But the thing that's interesting for me, you see, is that the picture you're painting now is much more like the picture that I personally have of Papaji,
right.
and the picture one gets of sort of Zen masters, the way they treat their disciples.
Yeah.
And this sort of idealistic picture of the silent man on a couch with beautiful eyes suddenly is really only a rather faint kind of impression about him.
I think probably he was that very rare conjunction of saint and jnani.
See, he didn't think he was special. We're making Ramana special. That's what our own spiritual inadequacies are causing us to project Ramana as some amazing, incredible, fantastic being. But you know, whenever you talk the truth, you run up against the myths. That's the important point. You know, because this is a non-dual reality. You're just as valuable as Ramana. You're just as important as Ramana. I'm just as important as Ramana. Why? Because everything's Ramana. There is no difference here between people. You know, and human beings have this amazing, amazing need for status. You know, they just continually, they're always in this dualistic thing. I'm better than you. This one's better than that. We try to organize our whole existence on the basis of small up to big. Have bhakti for these great people, and particularly Ramana. He was a shining example of this knowledge, and that was the beauty of Ramana. You could trust a man like that because he lived that knowledge. Ramana was special for this reason. Ramana was special because he purified his mind to such a high degree. And that's the reason he was so luminous.
I think that the key word with Ramana is a Sanskrit term called sankalpa, which means, it's translated as will or intention. It means the resolve to follow a particular course of action or decision to take action is a sankalpa. And he said that's what separates the enlightened person from the unenlightened. He said the unenlightened people are always full of sankalpas, they're full of decisions about what they're going to do next, how they're going to plan their lives, what's going to happen next, how they change their circumstances to benefit the most in the short or long-term future. He said the true jnani has no desire whatsoever to accomplish anything in this world.
The stories around his illness were very striking. The fact that, you know, he had some small cancer on his arm and he never gave it much interest to be treated.
He did have the best Western medical treatment, but it was a malignant growth and kept coming back. You shouldn't get the impression that he wanted any of this treatment. His unwavering comment when people asked what to do was do nothing. He had everybody, allopaths, homeopaths, nature cure, Ayurveds, they all came one by one. And it was simply, he accepted their treatments because he felt they needed an outlet for their devotion. He didn't really have much interest in whether they succeeded or not. He let everybody one by one play with his body.
And in a sense, what you've just described is the way he led his whole life.
Yeah.
He basically let his whole life happen.
Right. Some village herbalist came along, made a concoction of leaves and put it on his arm. And the high-powered allopaths were horrified and thought they were losing time while this man's bundle of leaves was kind of rotting away on Bhagavan's arm, and compelled the ashram manager to take this poultice off so they could get back with their scalpels and their radium. And Bhagavan accepted their decision, even though he'd agreed to have this poultice on. So he took it off and he put it on the neck of somebody who had a cancerous growth on their neck and said, well, let's see if it does you any good. And that man got better and Bhagavan died.
The climax of my own spiritual experience took place during these last moments. As I stood in that small room, everything became shadowy, enveloped by invisible pure awareness. There was not the least feeling of separation from Bhagwan, or even the least vestige of sorrow on his physical death. Instead, there was a positive ecstasy and an elation of spirit which was nothing but the natural state of the self.